everybody. Thank you so much for coming out today. I know a lot of us are busy getting ready for Passover, and I appreciate you taking the time out of very busy schedules to be here. This workshop is for everybody, whether you know a lot about Passover and you've been making Seder for many years, or you know very little. Either way, you're going to learn some things and explore some ideas and hopefully leave with an uplifting feeling and excitement going into the holiday. The themes of Passover are really universal, whether you're Jewish or not, religious or not. It's a theme of liberation, of freedom. And that applies to everybody. And really the only way we can begin to experience liberation is to first identify where we are enslaved. And we'll return to that idea in the end. But that is a universal idea that we can all apply. So for millennia, Jews have been gathering every year to sit down at a special meal called a Seder and to go through step by step the history of the Israelites enslaved in Egypt. Most of us know the basics of the story. Israelites were enslaved. A leader named Moses arose. He helped with the exodus from Egypt. There were 10 plagues. There was the miraculous splitting of the Red Sea, which is actually in Hebrew Yam Suf, which means reed sea. It was a mistranslation. There's nothing red about the sea. I think maybe we think about it in terms of red because the waters closed over the Egyptian army and everybody drowned, so it has that association, but truly it was a sea of reeds, Yam Suf. And the Jews then wander in the desert for 40 years and they make their way to Israel. So pretty much everyone is familiar with that idea. And we sit down every year, we retell this story to our children and to ourselves. We use a special plate, a Seder plate, that has compartments for the symbolic foods that are on the table that we'll go through. And each one of these symbolic foods helps us to psychologically connect with a concept from our history and to reenact the story, especially for our children. According to the Hebrew Bible, the story of the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt was roughly in the 13th or 14th century BCE, which is the late Bronze Age. And some scholars link this to the reign of Ramses II. The exact date of the Exodus is up for some debate, but generally is estimated to be around 1270 BCE. And there's not only archaeological evidence in the Hebrew history, but the Egyptian papyri tell the story of a people that were enslaved that helped to build the monuments and the buildings, and they had Semitic names. So we do have corroborative evidence in the Egyptian culture for the story of the Exodus as well. But does anybody even know how the Israelites ended up in Egypt? The first Jew was Abraham, and he was Sumerian. Sumer was a very advanced culture in the Mesopotamia region in between the Tigris and Euphrates River. Here was Sumer, and here's Egypt. So how did the first Jew and the entire nation eventually end up in Egypt? Well, we have to go back to the lineage. Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac inherited the spiritual dynasty from Abraham. He continued the legacy, and Ishmael became the nation of the Arabs. He was exiled from the Abrahamic lineage. Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob continued that same legacy, the next generation. He was the grandson of Abraham, continuing that spiritual legacy. And Esau became the leader of the Edomite nation, and he was exiled. And then Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, had 12 sons. Now, have any of you seen the Broadway show, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, or you're familiar with it? So we know Joseph had a special garment. What was it? What kind of coat? Colors. Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, a coat of many colors, is the story that we all know. Joseph was given this special, beautiful, striped garment from his father, from Jacob, and the other 11 brothers, no coat. Now, we know the brothers were very jealous of this coat, and usually we're taught because it was exquisitely crafted and it took a lot of time and effort to make it, and only one son got the coat. But that might not be the whole story, because really for 11 brothers to be so angry about a coat that they sell their brother into slavery, I don't know if that really makes so much sense. So let's go a little bit deeper into the story. We have Mefarshim, the Chizkuni, who say that the coat, which in Hebrew is called ketonet pasim. ketonet is tunic, and pasim means stripes, may not be a striped coat, but rather a coat that extended from the stripes of the wrist, the creases in the wrist, to the creases of the ankle. So what's the significance of wearing a coat that goes from wrist to ankle? Well, where did Jacob give him the coat? At home. Joseph received this coat from his father while he was at home. And Jacob sends him on a mission. He says, go and walk for 3 days' journey to where all your other brothers are. They were shepherding the flocks. They were living a 3-day walk from home in the wilderness, working with the animals. They were shepherds. They were in the elements. They're working in the mud. They were the white-collar workers of the family, or the blue-collar workers, rather. And Joseph is the white-collar worker who comes to check on the brothers. And the father says, give me a report of how they're doing. Are the flocks surviving? Are the flocks increasing? Are the brothers taking good care of them? Are they behaving in the values I've instilled upon them? Go and look at them, come back and give me a report on how they're doing. So now Joseph travels out to where the brothers have been, sleeping outdoors without him. He's been at home in the air conditioning with his dad. And he comes out in the tunic that shows he can't work with animals. How can he work in the mud if he has an ankle-length garment on? How can he work with animals if he has big sleeves to here? So this coat wasn't that it was a beautiful rainbow-colored coat, but it was a garment of status that he is exempt from this work. He does not have to labor with the animals like they do. And not only that, he's coming out to tattletale on them, to bring a report back to their father. And of all the things to do, to go and report on them wearing his special coat was like rubbing salt in a wound. And the brothers are furious. And now you can see why they're really upset about this coat. This is what it represents, the unequal status that they have. But it's even more than that. The brothers know that every generation of their family, going back to their grandfather, someone gets the lineage, one son, and everyone else is out to pasture. And we have a tradition in Judaism that if you do something 3 times successively, it's called a chazaka, and it sticks. It's concretized if you do it 3 times. So this is going to be the 3rd time. And they know it's obviously Joseph. Joseph is the one who's coming out with a special status. He's inheriting from his father, and they're the schleppers. They're the workers out in the field. And they had enough of this. And they said, this is the first time it's not just 2 sons, the son that's in and the son that's out. It's now 11 sons are in, and this one should be the one that's out. We're going to turn the paradigm on its head, and we're not doing this anymore. We're going to get rid of Joseph. We're going to kill Joseph in his elite coat. And they're talked out of killing him. Instead, they decide they're going to sell him, and they're going to sell him into slavery in Egypt. And the Midianites and the Ishmaelites trade him, and eventually he ends up all the way south in Egypt. He starts working, he's a slave, he gets framed for a crime that he didn't commit, and he ends up even worse in a dungeon, in a jail, for decades. So this poor guy has had his brothers sell him into slavery. He doesn't know if he'll ever see his father or his family again. He's rotting in the pits of a dungeon in Egypt, a culture completely alien to his own. And the story could end there. I wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be here. That would be it. But something remarkable happens. The king, the Pharaoh, or Paro in Hebrew, has a nightmare. It's not a regular nightmare. It's a nightmare where he wakes up screaming in the morning, and he's troubled all day. Goes to bed that night, he has the exact same nightmare. The next day, he's beside himself, goes to sleep again, 3rd time, exact same nightmare, and he's frantic. And he wakes up in the morning and he says, that's it. This is not just a nightmare. I've had it 3 times. It's very disturbing. The details are very disturbing. I need to know what this dream means. It's not a regular dream. So he calls all his soothsayers and dream interpreters and necromancers and magicians. This was the Egyptian culture. They were very into this kind of dark arts. And one by one, they give an interpretation of the dream. And he says, that's not it. That's not it. That's not it. You don't get it. That's not it. And now he's in a very foul mood. He's in a rage. This is not good for the Egyptian citizens. They don't want an angry, vengeful ruler. And so one timid person, so to speak, puts up their hand, the steward, the butler, and says, listen, years ago when I was in jail, there was another guy in jail with me. He was a Hebrew slave, and he could interpret dreams. I have to tell you, he twice interpreted dreams correctly, and maybe it's worth, getting this Hebrew slave and letting him interpret your dream. And the Paro likes the idea, to everyone's surprise, and has Joseph dragged out of the dungeon, thrown in front of him, and he tells him the dream. And Joseph right away interprets the dream, and not only interprets the dream, but gives the Pharaoh the solution to the troubling details in the dream. And Pharaoh says a very interesting thing. He says to his officials, can we find anyone else in Egypt who is like this man, who is so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? The Pharaoh, who believes in polytheism and all kinds of deities, for some reason is convinced that Joseph is filled with the spirit of the Hebrew God, that the Egyptians respected as one of their pantheon of gods. And he says to Joseph, he turns to him and he says, because God has shown you all of this, I know there is no one as wise as you in all of Egypt, and you shall be the steward over my house. And he elevates Joseph to be second in command of all of Egypt, only subject to the Paro. He's the viceroy over the whole massive country. And what was this dream? What did Joseph say that was so profound and so prophetic? So the Nile in Egyptian culture was revered. And it was really the epicenter of Egyptian religion and culture, because the Nile would overflow, and that's how all the crops would be watered, and that's where all of their life sustenance came from. And Paro's dream is that he is standing on the bank of the Nile, the epicenter of the world, and suddenly a beautiful, plump, healthy cow clambers up over the bank with silky fur and shining eyes, the epitome of health and vitality. And then a second cow, and then a third, and so on until there are 7 fat, healthy cows grazing on the bank of the Nile. But then suddenly, a skeletonized, sickly, monstrous cow clambers up over the bank, and then a second, and a third, until there are 7 skeletonized, sickly cows standing next to the 7 healthy, radiant cows. And then the 7 skeletonized cows proceed to devour the healthy cows, completely devour them, bones and all. But what really bothered Paro in the dream, what didn't make sense to him, was that the skeletonized cows were no fatter after they'd eaten a massive, much bigger, fatter cow. Why wouldn't they have gained any weight from consuming a massive cow? He knew there was something very troubling about this detail. And when he tells the dream and he relays it to Joseph, Joseph says to him, those 7 fat cows are prophetic symbol of 7 years of agricultural abundance that Egypt is going to experience. Abundance upon abundance of agricultural wealth for 7 full years. But that's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. And the famine will be so profound, and it will ravage Egypt so completely that there will be no one left who remembers the years of plenty, which is why the skinny cows don't get fatter. They don't gain anything from the years of abundance. The years of abundance will have no lasting effect on Egyptian civilization. And Joseph says, but I know what we should do. We should store all the grain in the 7 years of plenty, and we should ration just subsistence amount to Egyptian citizens. And Pharaoh says, you are right. I know that you're right. And Joseph puts the plan into action. Now imagine, for 7 years, the granaries are overflowing. The Torah says they had to build not just store houses, but store cities, Pitom and Ramses, 2 store cities to manage this massive amount of grain. And yet the average citizen was given just subsistence, meager amount of grain. And you can imagine this is a very unpopular plan. When there's abundance, people want to luxuriate in it. They want to enjoy it. They want to celebrate and eat their fill and feel good. And they don't believe there's a famine coming. Look at the crops. They're amazing. And they grumble the whole first year. And then the second year, still subsistence quantity, and all the grain is stored, and they're grumbling a lot louder. And by the end of the 7 years, Joseph is extremely unpopular until the famine hits. And the whole time, the Paro has been supporting him. And when the famine hits, not only does Egypt have enough grain for everyone to survive, but they have a surplus. And all the people in the Mesopotamia and the ancient Near Eastern region, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Frisian, the Sadducees, all of them traveled down to Egypt to buy grain from the Egyptians. And the Egyptians probably charged a high price for this grain because it was life or death. They're good businessmen. And as a result of this, Egypt became a regional superpower. Their wealth blew up exponentially. They saved the whole Fertile Crescent, which was not so fertile at that time. And Joseph was the rock star of Egypt. The story could end there. But then something happens. Torah says, Vayakum melech chadash, a new king arose, a new Paro, shelo yada et Yosef. It didn't know of Joseph. How could that be? How could it be that this person is second in command to the Pharaoh? He saves the country. He enriches the country tremendously. He's known throughout Mesopotamia. He's never heard of him? Never heard of Joseph? How could the new king never have heard of Joseph? It's impossible. It has to be that he dismissed Joseph's contribution, as if he never heard of him. He has no relevance. He has no meaning. He has no bearing in our story. Okay. Let's go from there. What really happened is that the Paro hated Joseph. Why? Because in their time that Joseph and his family, let's add one detail. Joseph's family eventually travels down to Egypt to buy grain as well. He's eventually reunited with his brothers, with his father, and they're invited by the Paro to settle in Goshen. They're treated very well. They are beloved by the Pharaoh and the community. At the time that Joseph's family traveled down, they were approximately 70 people. We're now 144 years later. The king says, never heard of him. But Goshen, that had 70 souls, now has millions. Apparently, the Israelites were incredibly fertile. They were blessed in this time. There's a midrash, they had 6 babies at once, but that might just be metaphoric language, meaning they became incredibly abundant in Egypt, and they were very successful. These are not idiots. They were doing well. And of course, it's an age-old story. Jews are settled. They're doing well. What's to like about that? And the Paro does not like it. But not only doesn't he like it, he also doesn't want to kick them out. Why? If he doesn't like Joseph's family, why doesn't he just expel them from Egypt? He could do whatever he wanted. The Torah tells us that he doesn't want to lose the contribution that they make to the society, but he also doesn't want them to ever one-up the society. So he devises a plan. He's going to enslave all of the Israelites. And he does it in a very sneaky way. Pesach in Hebrew is Pesach, a soft mouth. Peh is mouth, Sach is soft. He does it in a gentle, in a cunning way. He says, listen, all of the citizens of Egypt, including the Israelites, now have to produce a quota of bricks, straw and bricks. And everyone's fine with that. And the Israelites are fine with that. They're good citizens. They want to contribute their wealth, their work to the wealth of the country. And they make their bricks. And then the next edict comes along. It's like, the Egyptians need to return to their regular jobs, but the Israelites should continue making the bricks their contribution. And again, Israelites don't want to push. They're guests in this country. They don't mind making some bricks. So they don't argue and they continue making their quota of bricks. And then the next edict comes out. We're now going to double the amount of bricks that have to be made. And again, we don't want to complain. We don't want to make a fuss. And now they're working most of the day building the bricks, but trying to do their jobs on the side as well. And then the next edict comes out. So the bricks are made of mud mixed with straw, chopped up straw mixed into mud. And that brings us to the first item on our Seder plate, which is the charoset that we use to tell the story of the mud and the straw. Charoset is some kind of chopped up fruits and nuts. Many families have different recipes. We use apples and nuts and cinnamon and wine. Sephardic cultures use dates and figs and apricots or bananas. But you make a paste that looks like straw in mud. Why is that so significant? And that goes, by the way, on our Seder plate over here. Because once the Israelites had to procure the straw themselves, it was now a full-time job. They had to get up early in the morning and harvest the straw, chop the straw, make the bricks. There was no time for anything else. And to make sure they were meeting their quota, Egypt kindly appointed taskmasters over them to supervise the making of the bricks. That's now their full-time job. And just like that, you have an entire people that are enslaved, bit by bit by bit. And it's the story of the frog in boiling water. Are you familiar with this idea? If you had a pot of boiling water and you took a frog and you dropped a frog in, which we never do, it's horrible, the frog would feel the boiling water and it would hop right out and it would save itself. But if you put the frog in cold water and you turn the flame up very, very gradually, the frog will habituate to discomfort. It'll be a little hotter and it'll accept it. And it'll be a little hotter and it'll accept it. And then before the frog is able to escape, it's boiled in the pot. And that's exactly what happened to the Israelites. Bit by bit by bit, with a Pesach, with a soft mouth and a small edict and a small rule and a small change and a small yellow star and a small absence from school, the people become enslaved when they accept bit by bit. So that is the charoset, why we put it on our Seder plate, to remember that level of enslavement. Okay. Now we move on to the chazeret and the maror. We have two vegetables that we put on the Seder plate. The maror in the middle, and the chazeret is here. Okay. Chazeret today is symbolized by romaine lettuce. You see the romaine lettuce over there? Romaine lettuce apparently used to be a much more bitter vegetable, but through cultivation, it's now a sweet vegetable. We still use it in memory that it was bitter. But we all use this interestingly shaped phallic maror. And there are a lot of jokes that go around every year about them, but this is what they look like. We peel this peel off. There's some slices here you can come and look at. We shred it up in our house, and it is a very, very pungent, mustardy kind of bitter herb. Now, why two kinds of bitterness? Why do we need both on the plate? Okay. So first of all, we have the enslavement, the working that the Israelites had to do. But it wasn't just simply physical labor. The Egyptians were sadistic. So they would think of ways to make the work more painful, more humiliating. Sometimes the men would have to sit out while they watched their wives doing their work and their quota, and they weren't allowed to assist. Or the very elderly would be made to go into the bottom of the mud pits and stomp the mud and the straw, and they'd fall to their death in the mud and they'd be left there. Whatever could be done to humiliate and degrade and cause the most bitterness is what was done. So it was an extremely demoralizing and bitter experience. And that is one kind of bitterness. But there was another kind. This slavery went on for 8 generations. Now, many of us know our great-grandparents' names, but do you know, anyone, a show of hands, your great-great-grandparents' names? Or your great-great-grandparents' names? How many generations can you go back? Maybe 4. Most of us can't go back more than 4. Now imagine 8 generations. You're a slave in Egypt, and for 8 generations, your family has been enslaved. You don't know anyone in your lineage who has ever not been a slave. You don't have any family stories passed down about a relative who has not been a slave. You don't imagine being anything but a slave because you can't remember anything else. That is a psychological bitterness. That is a psychological slavery. Because if you can't imagine anything else, you're already trapped. And that is such a deep level of bitterness. And Passover is really about psychologically freeing ourselves where we're trapped. And that, in my opinion, this is my idea, so I might be wrong, but that is why we have two types of bitter herb. One for the physical bitterness and one for the psychological bitterness, which in a way is much more dangerous. The next item on the plate is the parsley and the salt water, this little bowl of salt water here. Okay. Parsley is called the karpas. And we relate to that because an amazing thing happens in the Passover story. The slaves are living their bitter lives, they're miserable, and then the king dies. Torah tells us the king passed away. And right after the king passes away, the very next sentence in the Torah is that the Israelites, for the very first time, cry out to God. Why? Why are these two ideas juxtaposed next to each other? What does the death of the king have to do with, for the very first time in generations, crying out to God about slavery? So there's many ideas. I'll give you three today. The first one, there's no connection. It's a chronological history book, and it just happened to be that's when the king died, and after that, they cried out. That is one possible answer. Another answer could be that they were hoping that when the king died, their life would improve. And when the king died and nothing changed, that's when they cried out. That was their last hope. We had hoped that now this evil ruler was gone, someone better, more compassionate would come in, and we'd be saved, and nothing changed, and they were broken, and they cried out. That's a possible answer. But there's a much more dark and ugly answer that there are many, many, many midrashim about. There's a concept in Torah, lashon sagi nahor, where we use a euphemism for a negative term. For example, in the Torah, a prostitute is called a kadesha, a holy woman, and it means the opposite of a holy woman. A blind person is called one who can see, because blindness was considered so devastating in the ancient world that it was like one who was dead. We didn't even want to say the word blind, so we say one who can see, meaning one who can't see. And when we say that the paro died, it could mean the paro actually contracted leprosy, because a leper is excommunicated and kicked out of the country, in the encampment. And this is the supreme leader, the supreme ruler. How could he let it be known that he had leprosy and have the humiliation, this God king, of being kicked out, not only of the palace, but out of Egypt completely? So leprosy in the ancient Near Eastern world was a fate akin to death. And the paro's doctors and magicians told him, we'll keep this secret because we have a cure for leprosy. And the cure for leprosy is to bathe every day in a bath full of blood, human blood. That was supposedly would have curative powers against leprosy. And where did the blood come from for the paro's initially daily bath and then twice a day bath? From the Jewish babies. And there are many stories in the Midrash that the babies were held over the bath, their necks were cut, and they were drained once a day or twice a day till they filled up a tub, and he would bathe in this blood. And it is then that the Israelites finally cried out to God. This was unbearable. So until this moment where the king contracts leprosy, is killing the baby, sometimes in front of the mothers, bathing in their blood, they cannot take it anymore. And that's the first time they cry out to God and they ask for help. We can't go on. This is unbearable. This has broken us, and we can't go on anymore. And that is symbolized, the crying is symbolized by the salt water, like salty tears. And we take the karpas, the parsley, during the Seder, and we show our children. We dip it into the salt water. We dip it into our tears. But parsley, karpas, is actually a symbol of renewal. It's a spring herb. It's a sign of growth and hope and future. Why are we taking that and dipping that into tears. It's an opposite binary. And I think there's two answers to that. The first is that, like a seed that you put in the ground, before that seed can sprout, it has to decompose and break apart. The Israelites had to get to the lowest point they could be in before they cried out. And sometimes getting to the very lowest we can be is the beginning of the healing. Recognizing where we're enslaved is the beginning of freedom. And there was a hope in the fact that they were calling out, because you don't call out if you're hopeless. There's no point. The fact that they actually called out to God shows on some level they had hope. So that's why we take the sign of hope and rebirth and we dip it into the tears. So those are the next items on the Seder plate. Okay. Next. We next have the zroa. Zroa is usually up here. And that is the roasted shank. You can use a lamb bone. You can buy them in the stores already roasted. You can roast your own. You could use a chicken bone. Some people even use a red beet, symbolizing like the redness of meat. But we symbolize a roasted lamb. Why? Because when the Israelites finally left Egypt, the Pharaoh did not want them to go. And Moses came along and said, that's it. We're going. We're leaving tomorrow. And he went to all the Jews and said, everybody take a lamb and slaughter it outside your front door. This is a very risky thing to do because a lamb was sacred to the Egyptians. Much like the Hindus have cows that are sacred and the cows, walk unmolested through the town because they're sacred. It was the same with the lambs. They roamed freely. They were considered sacred. No one was allowed to touch them or bother them in any way. And now Moses is telling the Israelites, go and catch one and slaughter it right outside your front door. Incredibly dangerous thing to do for slave people to do in the face of their oppressors. He said, but not only that, take the blood from this lamb and smear it on your doorpost. Because I'm telling you that tonight, the angel of death is coming into Egypt. And the angel of death is going to slaughter every firstborn male, much like the Egyptians slaughtered every firstborn and all the males of the Israelites. And we want that angel of death to pass over your house, hence the name Passover. And it will know by the blood on the door not to harm your household. But it was more than that. They were instructed to take this lamb, the symbol of divinity of their oppressors, and roast it on a spit outside of their homes. It's such an insult to the Egyptians. Take their God, slaughter it, and roast it on a spit. The law that Moses told them was you cannot even break one bone of this lamb. It has to be identifiably a lamb. It can't be lamb burgers. It can't be a pot of bubbling lamb stew where you're not sure what's in the pot. This has to clearly be a lamb, not broken, not changed, and everyone is now roasting it outside. It was such a power move. They were saying, this is what we think of your gods because we believe in our God and we're leaving this place. So we have the zroa on our Seder plate to remember the defiance, the chutzpah of taking their God and roasting it for all to see. The next item is the beitza, the egg. And usually it's a roasted egg. And you can take the egg and put it in the oven and roast it. What we do in our family is we just light a match and we put a little singe on the egg just to symbolize that it was roasted. Why a beitza? Why an egg? So an egg is a sign of renewal. We're now moving on in our direction around the Seder plate and around the story into hope, renewal. The Israelites leave Egypt. They're in the desert. They're on their way to Israel, and they're hopeful. And the egg is roasted because in the future, the Israelites, the Jews, will have a temple where they will perform offerings that were burnt, and that egg is symbolizing that future burnt offering that's going to be offered. Okay. But there's one more thing we have to talk about, and that's the matzah. We all eat matzah at the Seder with our Seder items. And why matzah? Does anyone know what matzah is often referred to? The bread of affliction or the bread of slavery. And it's kind of a weird thing. We're celebrating freedom and we're eating the bread of slavery. And many of us learned in kindergarten or third grade that when the Israelites left Egypt, which first of all, you had millions of people mobilized and leaving and on foot with all of their possessions and their children and the elderly and their animals in 1 hour. That in itself is a miracle to me. Has anyone ever packed up to go somewhere with the kids, right? An hour? And we all have heard they left so quickly that their dough didn't have time to rise. The dough didn't have time to rise. So we all think of this that maybe normally their dough did rise, but this time their dough didn't have time to rise. I think that is a misunderstanding of the text. The Egyptians were master bakers. They had a whole culture of baking. The elite had very complicated breads and pastries that took a long time to rise, punch down, rise again. They were enriched with oils and spices and fruits and nuts. The next echelon in society had simpler breads that still rose, took time. But the slaves don't have time. Their time is not their own. Their time belongs to their master. So they had no elaborate bread. They never ate from the Egyptian bakeries. They had plain flour and water, no oil, not even any salt, that they would cook very quickly on a hot stone and eat in haste and hope they had a few minutes to eat and run off. They never had time for their bread to rise. It wasn't just on the exodus out of Egypt. This is a symbol of their whole life that was bare subsistence in haste. And in fact, when the Israelites finally make it into the desert, the very first commandment that they're given by God is to make a calendar, because that's what a free people does. A free people can have a calendar that they can fill with their own time and their own desires and their own activities. And it's a huge psychological shift to go from no time to the luxury of a calendar. So I don't think the bread didn't rise when they were leaving. I think they took what they always had with them, the bread that they never had the luxury of allowing to rise. And that is the symbol of the matzah. Now, matzah used to be a soft pita bread, like a laffa or like a wrap. That was the original matzah. We have these dry crackers now because once we started manufacturing matzah and shipping matzah and sending matzah out, these pitas would mold. They become moldy. And the solution was to dry them out and make them a cracker, just for practical purposes. But you can actually purchase the original soft kind of matzah in some of the markets here in Boca. And it's, I love matzah, but that is really nice to have a soft kind of pita on Passover also. And when we eat this on the Seder, the bread of affliction, the bread of slavery, but we eat it with abundant food, with our friends, with our family, reclining with 4 cups of wine. And we have 4 cups of wine because the redemption is mentioned 4 times. There are 4 sentences in the Torah about the freedom of the Jews. And we have this slave bread, but we're not physically enslaved anymore. It's the time to reflect on where are we slaves? And that's really the message of Passover that's universal to everybody. Are we slaves to addiction? Are we slaves to food? Are we slaves to caring what other people think of us? Are we slaves to the voice in our head that says, I'm not good enough, or I don't look good enough? That's what we have to identify on Passover. And we have to liberate ourselves from all of that, And the matzah is the way that we do it. In fact, some people save a little bit of matzah all during the year. And anytime they're feeling down about themselves or they're sick, they have a physical illness, they go and they eat a little bit of the matzah as a way to remind themselves, don't be a slave. Don't have slave mentality. We are a free people. So I hope that this was enlightening and helps you enjoy Passover holiday. One tradition we do in our family is I have the kids and my husband and I, we write down where we feel like this year we were slaves to work, slaves to school. My kids always write. And, maybe something we don't like about our behavior, I was hitting my sister or I was arguing with mom or whatever it is. I lost my temper. Slave to anger is huge. And we write it down. And when we go and we burn all the chametz, all the leavened bread, before Passover, we add those notes into that fire. And we try to visualize through the year improving, freeing ourselves, rather than seeing it as don't hit your sister. Free yourself from anger. Liberate yourself from petty squabbles. So I think it's a very beautiful holiday, and if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to answer. Yeah?
Well, I think it's from ignorance. All the sources that we have for what you said is the Torah. There's no other source. So a lot of this is interpretation, right? And stories.
Mm-hmm.
So all this that we're talking about is like a story based on a few facts that we think are true based on the Torah.
Well, it's interesting you say that. So years ago, I met with a big scholar, and I said to him, why does the Jewish liturgy say 3 times a day, we say, thank you, God, who took us out of Egypt? Why haven't we updated the liturgy to thank you, God, who took us out of Auschwitz? Why don't we, that's a much more, devastating historical event. And why don't we update it that we survived the Holocaust and built a nation? Like, surely that's more significant. And he said to me, what are you talking about? There's books and books and books written about, that was, a few years. There's books and books written about the suffering in Egypt that we don't commonly know of. We think it's just a few sentences in the Torah, but actually Josephus and lots of people, or lots of historians throughout history, wrote about oral traditions that were passed down about the horrors of slavery and what happened. It was 210 years. And it was much more significant than I realized. It was much more horrific than I realized. The stories of what they did to children and babies, they would, in those bricks, there was actually an edict at one point that babies were included in the mud and the straw in the bricks, and the bricks in the pyramids and in the walls had baby corpses in it. It was a sadistic society. In fact, we have many, many writings enjoining us all the time not to be like the Egyptians. And we're not talking about modern day Egyptians. We're talking about the ancient Egyptians. They were so barbaric and they were so perverse that we have all these documents telling us whatever their haircut was, don't cut your hair like the Egyptians. Whatever they had tattoos, ritual tattoos, that's why tattoos are somewhat anathema to Jews, because they made religious tattoos. Anything that they did to this day, 3,000 years later, we're still trying not to be like the Egyptians. So yes, in the Torah there's a story, but there's a whole apocrypha of other works that talk about this that's much more fleshed out. Thank you so much, everyone.